Thank you very much, Aristides. And let me begin by saying what a wonderful pleasure, a real thrill and an honor for me to be giving this inaugural symposium in Martha's honor. I won't say much. We have said a lot, and there's a lot more to say about Martha other than saying she's obviously a classicist, she's a humanist, she's an activist, and in all of those roles and many others, she's first and foremost a philosopher and a thinker, a theorist who's covered the theory, the philosophy of art, the philosophy of mind and emotion, the philosophy of morality, the philosophy of law, political philosophy. It's an extraordinary achievement by a Renaissance woman, and I'm extremely privileged and happy to be the one chosen to give this lecture. Just by way of background, let me say I've always been a great admirer of this association and of the general line of thought that Amartya and Martha are strongly associated with in its origins, the capability focus. And I think that it connects very deeply with themes that are close to my own expertise. I think of the capability approach as the wonderful thing about it is it involves so many social sciences and economics as well as philosophy. It's deeply important in development thinking, but also in thinking in general about the quality of life. And it's a great honor for me to be invited to talk to you. I must say I deeply identify with the work that you all do. What I'm going to take as my starting point is the question of how exactly the capability focus connects with thinking about liberty. Now, this has always been a theme, of course, from Amartya's work in the beginning and also in Martha's, a theme, the connection between capability, functioning capability, basic capability functioning, central capability functioning, and the notion of liberty. So with your permission, what I'd like to do is just give a very brief sketch of the history of liberty, a very, very brief sketch of the history of liberty, focusing obviously on some themes, and then I'd like to make some suggestions to you about how exactly, at least I found myself thinking about the capability approach, which I see as deeply congenial within the context of the way of thinking about liberty that I myself prefer. So in order to introduce these two different ways of thinking about liberty that I'm going to talk about and focus on in this brief history, let me just ask you, first of all, to think about a question. I'd like you to remember, if you know it, and let me tell you about it if you don't, the protagonists in Henrik Ibsen's play produced well over a century ago, 1879 in Copenhagen, A Doll's House. You remember in A Doll's House there's Torvald, the husband, who's a young and relatively prosperous banker, and his wife Nora. And the thing about this relationship that gets established very early on is that Torvald utterly dotes on Nora. He worships the ground she walks on. There's nothing she could do that would offend him, other than eating macaroons, which, if you remember, he doesn't like, but even eating macaroons, she can do as she wishes because she hides the macaroons in her skirts. But apart from the macaroons, he gives her, as we say, carte blanche. She, within the ambit of choice that you might think as contextually reasonable for someone in that period, she can choose exactly as she wishes. He has no wish whatsoever to interfere with what she eats, where she goes, where she shops, who she associates with. She has utter freedom of choice, as you might say. But there's one little hitch, isn't there, which is obvious, which is under the law of the time in Scandinavian countries and, of course, the world over, women in her position were essentially subject to the will of their husbands. So while she enjoys carte blanche, freedom of choice in this great range, that's entirely at the goodwill, because of the goodwill, the grace and favor, if you like, the leave or permission of her husband Torvald. So she depends on his remaining goodwill, but of course, from his point of view, there is no possibility that the goodwill would disappear. He utterly dotes on her. So the question I want you just to keep in the background, and I'm going to show that these traditions will give you very different answers, is the question as to whether you think of Nora as free. Because there is a pull there, isn't there? On the one hand, with regard to the choices you might think relevant to the issue of freedom in her life, she can choose more or less as she wishes within the resources available to her, which are relatively substantive. On the other hand, she's subject to the will of Torvald. All she does, she can choose as she wishes, but that's only because Torvald wishes that she should choose as she wishes. And on that front, you think, well, maybe she isn't really free. Maybe she's really just subject to Torvald. So there's an issue there, an issue in thinking about freedom as to which way you go on that question. Now, let me sketch for you in this very, very brief history of liberty as I think about it. And I'm setting aside now some strands in that history. Let me just talk to you about what I see as the two major strands in that history. The first, the earlier one, I think of as the classical Republican approach. The second, which I'll introduce a bit later, is the classical liberal approach. I don't think it's classical liberal in quite the sense in which my esteemed chair thinks of classical liberalism. I think of it as more libertarian. It's classical liberal as that phrase came to be used in the early part of the 19th century. But let's start with the classical Republican way of thinking about freedom. That, of course, has got Greek origins, as we all know, but it really comes to, I think, sharpest focus in the thinking of people associated with the Roman Republic. Of course, one figure in the development of classical Roman Republican thinking was actually a Greek, and that was Polybius, who comes to Rome, as you may remember, in the 2nd century BCE. He comes actually as a hostage from a Greek city, lives with a major important Roman family for a period as a hostage, in effect, I suppose as a sort of slave, but actually is released from that after a period and stays on in Rome. And the thing about Polybius, a bit like de Tocqueville coming to America, is that he falls in love with Rome. And he tells the Romans how wonderful they are. And just as the Americans loved de Tocqueville, the Romans loved Polybius. He told them they had it made. Actually, he emphasized 3 strands in Roman thinking, Roman ideals, and Roman institutions, which I'll just briefly mention. One which he actually didn't stress, but it became more and more prominent in writers whom he influenced. Writers like, for example, Cicero in the following century and the historian Livy. One theme is, of course, a way of thinking about freedom. Now, arguably, that way of thinking about freedom pre-existed the Roman Republic, indeed had an airing in the Greek world as well, but in any case, this is what came to be established as the Roman way of thinking about freedom. To be a free person, to be a liber in this way of thinking, that is central in Polybius's, as it comes to be called, republicanism. On this way of thinking, the paradigm, the model, the exemplar of someone who's free is the citizen, the kivos. And the contrast between someone who's free and someone who's not free is the contrast between the kivos and the servus meaning basically the slave. The slave suffers what is called in Latin of the time dominatio, because the kivos who employs, who has in his household, it is always a he. Unfortunately, I'm not going to qualify that for sake of brevity. The servus is subject to the kivos as to a dominus, subject to the citizen in whose household he operates, as to a lord or a dominus. And insofar as he's subject to that dominus or lord, he endures or suffers what is known as dominatio. That's where I got the word domination from. It's obviously the nearest English to the word dominatio. And in the Roman tradition, this is not due to Polybius, but it's very much part of the indigenous tradition that he writes about. In this Roman tradition, you didn't become free just by virtue of the fact that you had a very nice dominus, a dominus who let you choose as you wish. So, for example, in the plays of Plautus, and the same is true of some other Roman comedians, comic writers of the time, playwrights, in Plautus, the figure of Tranio, for example, in one of his major plays, is a slave who explains to the audience that actually he's as free as any citizen because he's got a master who's most of the time absent, and even when he's present, he can get under the radar and keep the master sweet. And even when he can't placate the master in that way, he's cunning enough to be able to use his wiles and get to do what he wishes. So he explains to the audience how free he is, he, Tranio. But actually, that's a figure of fun, certainly of irony, in the Roman tradition. No one would have thought that Tranio is free. It's simply a joke that a slave would explain he's free because he can choose as he wishes. Because even though his master is a kind master, a kindly master, as we say in English, he's still a master. And the position is this. He allows Tranio choose as he wishes, let's suppose, the slave choose as he wishes. However, should his will change, then of course Tranio would no longer have that latitude of choice. So in this tradition, being free isn't a matter of having latitude of choice. It's a matter of your position as a person in relation to somebody else. If your ability to choose as you wish depends on another person's will, as in depending on their will remaining a good will, remaining indulgent towards them, then you are subject to that will in quite a strict, definable sense. And if you're subject to that will, then that will is the will in charge, not your will. And if that will is the will in charge, then you are an unfree person. You're given a sort of indulgence, as it's often called in the later English, a latitude, as I say, of choice, but that doesn't constitute freedom. The other aspects of the Roman tradition that Polybius emphasizes very strongly is that in Rome, people enjoy the citizens, that is to say. Of course, they're limited to males and so on. The citizens enjoy freedom in that sense, the lack of dominatio, the lack of being beholden to anyone else, insofar as you have a law that satisfies two constraints. On the one hand, it's a law before which all citizens are equal, and it's a law that protects each citizen in a range of what you might think of as personal choice, in a range what later comes to be called in the 17th century the fundamental liberties, like the sorts of choices you can exercise, anyone can exercise, at the same time that other people exercise them in their own case. The choice of associating with whoever you want to associate with, the choice of living in the territory of the state wherever you wish to live, the choice of speaking out. I mean, these at least are our versions of the basic liberties. The Roman notion was that with respect to the locally defined basic liberties, the law protected each person equally. And insofar as it protected them, it meant that no one else in that area of choice had the position of a dominus. So they didn't suffer dominatio at the hands of anyone else, a civis. That's the ideal. The second strand in this way of thinking about law or the institutions is that this law that protects people against private domination, as you might say, this law is itself the work of citizens. It's a law that the citizens partake, they would have said more or less equally, it certainly was less rather than more equally, but it was a law that citizens certainly participated in shaping, insofar as all of the laws of Rome had to be passed by one or another of a number of public bodies. The tribal assembly was one body, the centuriate assembly was another body, the council of the plebs, by some count, was another body. Any law had to be passed by the people, even though in order to be considered, it had to be proposed by a member of the elite, someone who was in the Senate, who had held at the time held public office. So the idea was that insofar as the law which protected you against private domination was itself a law that you shared with others who have common interest with you, in controlling, this also was a law that didn't impose public domination. So on the horizontal sphere, if you like, or dimension, you were not dominated by others insofar as you were protected by this law. And in the vertical dimension, vis-a-vis government or the state, you weren't dominated either insofar as this law that protected you privately was also not publicly dominating because it was your law. It was the people's law. Now that Roman tradition is summed up in a way in a phrase that is used in the Roman law books that were put together by Justinian in the, is this more effective? It was put together by Justinian in the 6th century, working, of course, from Constantinople. In that law, the status or position of the Roman citizen is described as being sui juris. Very interesting Latin phrase, roughly meaning of your own jurisdiction. And the Roman citizen, also called the liber simply, became translated into English as the free man. The liber, or the civis, the free man or the citizen, was sui juris in two respects. One, within the sphere of private or personal choice, later the basic liberties, he is protected against private domination, and he's sui juris of his own jurisdiction insofar as the very law that protects him is a law that he protects equally with others in shaping. So there's both that horizontal and vertical protection against domination. Now that way of thinking about freedom and that way of thinking about the law that gave you freedom by virtue of protecting you publicly while not yet being publicly protecting you privately without being publicly dominating, that idea of a law and of the freedom the law could give you obviously disappears in the Dark Ages effectively. There are various strands of thought in various parts of Europe, but it comes to life magnificently in the cities of northern Italy in the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance period, the High Middle Ages. Because in cities like Siena or Florence or Venice, of course, the burghers of these new trading centers, who have usually established themselves in control of their own law, putting aside the rule as it had been of the local signore or lord, they began to think of themselves in Roman terms. They began to think of the freedom they enjoyed in republican way. They began to see themselves, say by contrast with the subjects of a monarchical France or Spain or the papal Rome, the papal states. They saw themselves as enjoying something very special because they lived, as they thought of it, those who were citizens, usually propertied mainstream males, it must be said, but they thought of themselves as each being protected in the sphere of choice that was proper to them, the fundamental liberties as they become known. Each saw himself as being protected by those laws, where the laws were actually laws that they cooperated with others in establishing. So you had both protection against private domination and protection against public domination by virtue of one and the same law. This tradition of thinking spreads from northern Italy in the period of the Renaissance and somewhat later to many European countries. So for example, you get the Polish Republic of the Nobles, essentially set up by people who'd been educated in the universities of northern Italy. You get, of course, the Dutch Republic when they throw out the Spaniards and establish a republic full of these ideas that are inherited from this period. But above all, you get the English Republic, established in 1649, comes to an end, a rather inglorious end, in 1660 with the restoration of the king. But the welter of ideas that leads to the execution of Charles I in 1649, for example, is in great part due to the importation into England of these classical ideas, basically relayed through the Renaissance learning of northern Italy. Thomas Hobbes said it very nicely. He, of course, was an opponent of this new republican way of thinking. He favored a rather absolute ruler, and in particular, his favorite was, of course, having a king, as you had a king in the early 1640s. Hobbes said of this learning, as he calls it ironically, these ideas that had come from this classical republican tradition, he says, never was learning so dearly bought at such a cost, because as he saw it, the cost was revolution. This learning led people to throw out the king and try to establish a community within which the law was really the people's law, and it was a law which protected the people, at least the propertied mainstream males, equally, answering to the older idea. Now, after the Restoration, curiously, these ideas remain strongly full of life in the English-speaking world. They become reconciled with the constitutional monarchy as it becomes in England, they come to establish what historians often describe as the Commonwealth way of thinking, which is really the orthodox way of thinking about freedom and about law in certainly the later 17th century, after the 1688 Glorious Revolution, so-called, through the 1700s. And these ideas spread to all of the English-speaking world, in particular to America. They also spread rapidly to France, where everyone is studying what's going on in England, because, as Montesquieu says in The Spirit of the Laws, published in the early 1700s, 1730s, as he says, Britain, as it's now become from 1707 with the Act of Settlement, Britain, he says, it's the British Constitution, it's an unwritten constitution, the British way of doing things, he says, is the only constitution in the world whose aim is liberty. And in this way of thinking, it's deeply republican in the classical sense. Again, the notion is that we have a law that is essentially the law of the people. It's made by the king in Parliament, where the Parliament is thought to be representative of the people. And it's a law equally that's hammered out in the courts, but they're common law courts, where juries representing ordinary people and judges who are responsive to juries and to ordinary strands of thinking establish this law as, so to speak, emanating from the people rather than being imposed from above by a single monarch. So in this way of thinking, you've got this British law, this system of law, that is the people's law, but it equally, so there's no public domination, and it's a law that gives you private non-domination by virtue of protecting you equally with others against the possibility of interference by others. Now, of course, this is highly idealized, as the Roman way of thinking in Polybius, in Cicero and Livy was highly idealized about the Roman Republic, or Machiavelli's thinking in the discourses about Florence was idealized too, but certainly the 18th century, 17th and 18th century authors, they really do idealize Britain at the time. But nonetheless, you get this powerful way of thinking about freedom and about law. That law makes us free by virtue of identifying for each of us what in England at the time is called the fundamental liberties, the choices where we are our own boss. By identifying those, by protecting us in the sphere of the fundamental liberties, but equally by being a law that is not imposed on us from above by an alien will. Because even though there is a monarch, it's not like the French monarchy, it's not absolute, it's a monarchy that's constitutional, where the king acts in Parliament and in Parliament only. So, for example, in hailing this notion of freedom, Algernon Sidney in the 1660s talks about freedom in this sense is independency upon the will of another. You're independent of the will of any private other person. You're also independent of the will of a ruler that might be imposed on you from above. You're free and able to walk tall is a phrase that often occurs. So, for example, John Milton, who of course is a great defender of the English Republic and very much part of it, talks in the 1650s about how in this republic each person can walk tall, look others in the eye, and no one, so to speak, is haughty or looks down their nose at others. This is a commonwealth or a republic of equals, equally protected under an equally controlled, popularly controlled law. So, for example, in the middle of the 1700s, well, earlier 1700s, Cato's Letters, which is a radical tract, it describes liberty. It says, liberty is to live upon your own terms. Almost a direct translation of sui juris. Live upon your own terms. He said, by contrast, slavery, always the opposite, is to live at the mercy of another. And they're all insistent that it doesn't matter if you have a boss, and no matter how kindly that boss is, he's still a boss. You're not free if you've got a boss. So, for example, Richard Price, who's a great defender of the American cause, which we'll come to in a moment, he says of individuals and communities, he said, they cannot be denominated free if they have masters over them, however equitably and kindly they may be treated by that master. Just having a nice master does not make you free. You're unfree if you're subject as a person to the will of another person. And in this tradition, freedom now gets to be associated with, for example, being able to look others in the eye, being able to walk tall. A whole language develops in English of derogating those who are not free. They're said to be slaves and to be slavish, to have to kowtow to others, to have to fawn and toady, to have to bend the knee, to have to tug the forelock if you have a forelock, or tip the cap if you're wearing a cap. They have to look down and pay obeisance to those who are stronger. By contrast, those who are free can walk tall as equals with others. So the policy implications of this way of thinking are, to go back to the private-public divide, in private, that's to say in the realm of what law defines as the basic liberties, you've got to be entrenched against the power of others in your life. You've got to be your own, well, it is always your own man, alas. And the second policy implications is about the public world, that the law that gives you that sort of protection has to be law that's under your control equally with others. Now let's go back very briefly with this tradition in mind to Nora and her relation with Torvald. And let me just ask you, in this way of thinking, would you say that Nora is free in relation to Torvald? And of course the answer is absolutely not. Clearly she is the very exemplar of someone who lives under the will of another, albeit it's a kindly or gentle will. It's still another's will, it's not her will. Okay, now onto the classical liberal tradition. So the interesting thing about the Republican tradition and the American colonies is this, is that it's used by the Americans, this tradition, in order precisely to protest against how the British are treating them. Now you may remember in 1765, I think it was, the British introduced the Stamp Act, which introduced a tax that by American perception certainly was not a tax that the British government, the Westminster Parliament, was entitled to impose on them, the Americans. They were colonies in America, there were 13 in all, and those colonies, however, had their own legislature and their own governor in most cases, and they felt they were their own bosses, and they'd learned this language about if you're free, you're not subject to any alien or arbitrary will, meaning a will that isn't controlled by you. And so they respond badly to the Stamp Act, which appears like interference by an alien will, and protest. And in response, the British Parliament, the Westminster Parliament, actually withdraws the Stamp Act. So it all sounds hunky-dory. Were they happy? Well, they might have been happy, except for what the British did, which is, apart from having the repeal of the Stamp Act, they added something that came to be known as the Declaratory Act. And the Declaratory Act, passed in 1766, essentially said, now look it, we're being nice to you and we're withdrawing this because you don't like it, this particular tax, but we insist that we have the right to impose this tax if we wish. They insist that they have the full power and authority to make laws and statutes governing the Americans. Now, in terms of the very ideology, the Republican way of thinking the Americans have inherited from the British, this means the British Parliament is saying, we're the boss. We're a very nice boss. We're withdrawing the Stamp Act. We're not imposing very heavy taxes, but we reserve the right and power to do so as we wish. Joseph Priestley, the English chemist, a great political commentator apart from anything else, he said in 1776, he said, what is it the Americans complain about? And he explains, it's not that we're taxing them for 1 penny. It's the fact that we are claiming a power, should we wish, to tax them for their last penny. It's the power they're claiming that meant the Americans felt they were unfree. For example, in Boston in 1772, in response to what the British government's claiming, a collection of citizens, the council, said, we are degraded from the rank of free subjects to the despicable condition of slaves by this assumption of power on the part of the British Commonwealth, on the British Parliament. Now, of course, that was a rather remarkable thing to say in a country where there were actually real live slaves, but I'm going to put that aside for the moment. It's very interesting. They see themselves as slaves because they've been subject to the will of Westminster, albeit they acknowledge that Westminster is not a very harsh master, is a kindly master. But they're using this classical Republican way of thinking, filtered to them through the British experience, in order to criticize the British themselves. The Irish, incidentally, did exactly the same thing. I'm Irish by background, as some of you may know, but I'll save that story for another day, although it's a good story. This is a very brief history of liberty. I'm not only ignoring Ireland, alas, I'm ignoring France, which is even a greater oversight, but needs be. Now, in order to introduce the classical liberal way of thinking, let me draw attention to something that I think is really quite extraordinary, which is that this way of thinking, it has been foreshadowed by Hobbes, but Hobbes wasn't very successful, but it really comes in with a bang on the side of the British government, where you find intellectuals in London defending colonial rule from London by using a wholly new way of thinking about freedom. Best example of this is a pamphlet published by a barrister called John Lind in 1776. This was actually called Letters to Dr. Price. That's Richard Price, who was a great defender of the Americans, as Joseph Priestley was. But Lind has a wonderful argument. It's wonderfully clear, actually, in this little document. He says, what is liberty? And as if out of the blue, he says, well, liberty is just not being constrained or restrained in your exercise of choice. Wholly new way of thinking. I'll come back to that in a moment. But then he says, well, if liberty means just not being constrained, not being interfered with, let's put it, then of course law always takes away liberty, because law does interfere with you. It constrains you. It stops you doing things on pain of penalty. But that's interference. So all laws always take away your freedom. And then he says, so if freedom means not being restrained, and law always takes away your freedom, and now the Americans are subject to law, as we in Britain are subject to law, what's their complaint? Are the laws harsher in America than they are here? And he says, no, in fact, and that was common wisdom at the time, the Americans are doing rather better than we are back in the homeland. So what on earth is their complaint? It's a terribly interesting shift of terms of debate, absolutely rejecting the classical Republican way of thinking in favor of this new way of thinking, that to be free is just not to be constrained or restrained in your choice. Now, he has a footnote in that particular pamphlet. He says he got this way of thinking about freedom from an ingenious and worthy friend. You wonder, who on earth? You know, this is a whole new way of thinking. Well, it turns out that friend had written to him to complain about the fact that he, Lind, had been talking about this way of thinking about freedom without acknowledging him, this is now the friend, the origin of that idea. That friend turns out to be Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham had actually come up with, well, as he said in a letter to Lind, he said, this is a kind of discovery I had made half a year or more previously. He thought of it as a wholly new way of thinking about freedom. He saw it as that. He knew he was resisting the ancient way of thinking. Now, someone called William Paley, who's a very influential writer in 19th century Britain, partly because he's the inventor of the argument from design, whereby he says science tells us the world is constructed like a watch. What religion does is it directs us to the watchmaker. That made Paley, that particular argument, the darling of Victorian and earlier 19th century England. In fact, he writes a book, not on that issue, but that issue made him famous in his position, but he writes a book in 1786 called The Principles of Moral and Political Philosophy, and that book is reprinted more than any other non-fiction book in 19th century England. It becomes compulsory reading in the University of Cambridge. It's on the syllabus in the University of Cambridge for all undergraduates to read until 1925. And in that book, he endorses this new way of thinking. In fact, he describes the older way of thinking. He says it's the common way of thinking that belongs to many of the masters in the field, and then he opts for this new way of thinking himself, saying about it that it jars with the usage of common discourse as well as the example of many respectable writers. So these people are quite clear that they're introducing a new way of thinking about freedom. The old notion had said that freedom basically consists in security, private security against the domination of a private master, and public security against the domination of a single, for example, absolute monarch, a despot, who would impose the law on you from above. That's what freedom was, to be secure in your private life with the sphere of the basic liberties, protection against them, and to be secure in your public life insofar as the law was equally the work of you and your fellow citizens. The focus was, after all, on persons, on the freedom of a person. Each citizen was free insofar as he had that double protection, was sui juris in that double sense, privately or horizontally, publicly, and vertically, as you might put it. Now, in this new way of thinking, the focus is taken off people and is put on choices. And the idea is a choice is free. That's the fundamental bearer of the notion of freedom. And a choice is free just in case it's unconstrained, meaning uninterfered with. Now, in this new way of thinking, of course, contract becomes now the darling idea. Because if I enter a contract, as we say, freely by signing up to it, then by this account, I haven't been interfered with. No one has put a gun to my head in signing the document. To that extent, the contract is the very exemplar of a free act. On this way of thinking, it doesn't matter that the contract might be a contract under which, for example, enter under duress because there's no alternative, because it's starvation, or sign this employment contract. That doesn't matter. It's a free contract. You enjoy freedom in this new sense. It doesn't matter that in the relationship into which you contract, be it a marriage relationship or a workplace relationship, it doesn't matter that that contract is like a slave contract. In the older times, it makes you subject to the will of the person you've contracted with. That doesn't matter either, so long as you made it freely. You weren't constrained. You're free in operating the world of that contract. On the other hand, the state or government is not a matter of contract. As all of these people begin to insist, the law is imposed on you coercively. And so what you get in this tradition is the market becomes the be-all and end-all, because that's the area of free contract. Doesn't matter that it's a market in which you get great destitution, great exploitation, and so on, and duress. That doesn't matter. It's still free. On the other hand, the state is always coercing you in its operation of law. And so whereas in the older tradition focused on law as the source of freedom, this new tradition focuses on the market as the arena of freedom, so to speak, and law as always a problem. In this tradition, to use Reagan's phrase of a long time later, government is the problem, not the solution. Whereas in the older tradition, it's government in a way that is the solution. It's the only source. Now, I'm running out of time. This is a very, very, very brief history of liberty, as you can see. But you can see the policy implications are quite different here. The policy implications of the other position were you protect against private domination by the law and also against public domination by having the law be controlled by the people democratically and by various other means. In this new way of thinking, the market becomes what you're really looking for. Let it rip, because there you have uncoerced choice, and take law back to the very minimum required in order to establish a framework for the market. Now, to come to an end, where does the capability way of thinking fit in relation to these two traditions? Well, I should just first of all recall you to Nora and Torvald. And of course, you can see that the second tradition would say that Nora freely married Torvald. I mean, no doubt she could have refused. Nobody put a gun to her head to marry Torvald. Of course, in that contract, though she did enter it no doubt under duress, because a woman of the time was really in trouble if she didn't get a mate, didn't get a husband, and within the relationship it was a slave contract, was subject to Torvald. That didn't matter. In this way of thinking, Nora would enjoy a great deal of freedom. So it's a very different sort of answer. Now, I assume, I hope, that setting up these pictures in this way, it's pretty clear that the Republican is a more appealing way of thinking about liberty. Where does capability, or functioning capability, fit in this picture? And it seems to me pretty obviously what the answer is. The answer is that in order to enjoy freedom, for example, in the sphere of the basic liberties, let's look just at the horizontal, or what I've been calling, probably misnaming, the private dimension. Within this dimension, in order to be able to exercise the basic liberties, in order, as we say, to make them effective, in a phrase that's often used quite rightly, people have got to have various resources. They've got to have, for example, clearly resources that mean they don't fall into destitution. They've got to have educational resources, social resources, medical resources, judicial resources should they come before the courts. These resources, of course, have to be resources that are not thrust upon them. They have to be waivable or rejectable, and that's the emphasis in capability rather than functioning. But as I see it, these resources, these capabilities now, that your tradition is so focused on, can be related to the Republican way of thinking about freedom as they're exactly the resources that have got to be provided by the law in order that the law will, as it were, set people free, in order that the law will enable people to enjoy private non-domination. They have to have an assured access to those resources. So, for example, classical liberals will sometimes say philanthropy would be much better, for example, than state provision. But think about it in Republican terms. If I'm dependent on a philanthropist for being able to exercise my basic liberties, for example, for getting an education, a resource essential for being able to exercise your basic liberties, or for being able to have a decent food or shelter or whatever, then of course I'm subject to the will of that person. This is exactly a sort of dependency or domination that you're bound to reject. So what is really important in this way of thinking is that our law should be structured in such a way as to make available these waivable resources to people across the broad spread of concern that the capability tradition has actually targeted. So you can see, I think, at least as I think of it, how these two traditions are entirely complementary to one another, not at all conflictual. Let me just end with one quote. William Paley, in explaining why he went with this new way of thinking about freedom and did not stick with the older way of thinking, makes a very interesting remark. Because he says the older way of thinking, and he's essentially saying now that we're moving into a world where you can't just stick with propertied mainstream males, moving into a world where working men and also women have got to be the concern of the state as well. That is his background assumption. He's a reformist. But he says if we think about making them free in the sense of ensuring their non-domination, their freedom is non-domination, he says of this way of thinking about freedom, which he rejects, he says that it would inflame expectations that can never be gratified and disturb the public content with complaints which no wisdom or benevolence of government could ever remove. So basically what he's saying is it would just be too radical to marry this old way of thinking about freedom with this new egalitarianism. But of course, what I see your movement, our movement being about, is essentially rejecting that and saying, no, 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 you don't have to cave in, so to speak, adopt this much weaker notion of freedom in order to assert the equality of people in the sphere of freedom. You can still stick with the older view. It's just that freedom now is much more expensive. It's as expensive exactly as is a regime of capability functioning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Philip, for the most interesting lecture. Thank you very much. Now giving the floor, he has already had it, to Mojaffar Quisilbas, Professor of Economics at the University of York.
Yes, I'm actually Professor of PPE. So, but anyway, I should start by just saying I'm absolutely delighted, just as I was a few years ago when the association founded the first Amartya Sen lecture, just delighted from the bottom of my heart. And I think I speak from many people in the room that the association has organized this event. Having worked with Martha over the years, her contribution has been extraordinary. So thank you, Martha. A few comments, a few on history, a few on Nora in Ibsen's play, and a few on the relationship between capability and Republican freedom. Actually, that's the theme of this response. So it's striking that Philip's history of liberty is just very, very different from the kind of historical influences that one reads about on the capability approach, even if they're kind of sister or related views. So standardly, when we read Amartya's and Martha's work, we are led in the direction of Aristotle, Kant, Adam Smith, and Karl Marx, and then also T.H. Green. And while I'm not going to read out some of the citations from these texts from Marx in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, economic and political manuscripts, and from the materialist conception of history, it's clear that there's a notion of positive freedom which underlies the work on capability, which isn't kind of strongly conveyed in Philip's history of liberty. Now, I think the nearest to the actual view of capability as positive freedom that one gets in the kind of precursors is T.H. Green's. So he says, when we speak of freedom as something to be highly prized, we mean a positive power or capacity of doing or enjoying something worth doing or enjoying. That's a text that Amartya cites in one of his essays. So one thing I'd like to say about this is that when you go back, I don't know how many of you read Ibsen's play, A Doll's House. I mean, one of the things about reading Philip's book is it excites you into going back and looking at that text. And the later stages of that text, Nora, the wife of the wealthy banker, as you described him, Philip, reconsiders her whole life. And she turns out to be a classic case of what capability people would think of as adaptive preferences. So she states that her desires, her husband asks her whether she's happy, and she says that she isn't. And she says that her desires, she pretended, were the same as her husband's. So she's sort of comes to terms with the fact that she's been living under male domination all her life. And in responding to that, she concludes that she would like to be independent and stand on her own feet and to be educated. Now, some of what is going on there, some of what she wants and needs at that point, I think is positive freedom. I say more about this. I did actually write an entire paper as a consequence of Philip's work, but there is a slight difference, I think, between her desire for non-domination by her husband and her desire to be positively free. So that's one thing I'd like to say. I think capability and the historical tradition that informs that work has something to say about Nora's condition. The second thing I want to say about is very briefly an exchange between Amartya and Philip in a 2001 volume of Economics and Philosophy, and a lesson that I think we can draw from it, which actually Amartya also cites in his The Idea of Justice. So one concern that Amartya raises in that essay is a sort of concern that the capability view can't just be subsumed under the Republican view. And in that text, he discusses various scenarios which the capability view can distinguish where the Republican view can't distinguish them, and the other way around. There's some cases that the Republican view can distinguish what the capability can't. Now, I can't go into the details of these examples, but on reading the relevant texts, one thing that occurred to me is that I think the capability view can do some of the work that the Republican view does in those particular cases for a particular reason. If it's the case that domination is bad or dependency is bad because it undermines a person's self-respect, then it turns out that I think at least that some of the cases that Amartya is talking about, where he thinks the Republican view has something to say, a stronger discriminatory power than the capability view does. I think you can distinguish some of them if you start introducing the achievement of self-respect as an important capability. And of course, Martha does that in her list. So, going on a bit from that, I think that once you start taking the achievement of self-respect, non-humiliation and so on, dignity, some of the things that Martha has in that particular part of her list, you can do a great deal of the work that one can do with freedom as non-domination through the capability view. I think I'm just going to stop there. I mean, I think this is a slightly dangerous argument because it suggests that the view of freedom as non-domination can, as it were, be subsumed under the capability view, but I'll stop.
Thank you, Mozaffar.